Cleopatra is one of history's most famous queens. Her story is one of seduction, of resilience, of creativity, and a MacGyver-like ability to whip together tools that could be used against her rivals. But ultimately, it's a tragic one. She lived at a crossroads of empires. Rome was quickly becoming a superpower, and Egypt was in decline. She had to get creative if she wanted to hold on to power. She used her beauty and intelligence to seduce generals and kings, and she was more or less a savant when it came to geopolitics and manipulating empires. There's a reason history's most famous queen is Cleopatra. Let's discover why Cleopatra is admired throughout the world.
Eau de Cleopatra.
Cleopatra's extravagant perfume ships were just one of the examples of how much she loved her fragrances. And she loved them more than a dictator loves propaganda. She loved them so much that she is said to have built, or at least kept very close tabs on, the operation of a perfume factory. The factory was located in the ancient Egyptian city of Thumais. There were two main types of perfumes produced that archaeologists know of. One was called Medizian and the other was called Metopian. Basically like the Chanel No. 5 of ancient Egypt.
After a series of chemical analysis of the substances found at the old perfume factory, scientists have actually been able to figure out what the pharaoh might have smelled like. Apparently, the fancy perfume she doused herself in was a spicy, sweet concoction of cinnamon, myrrh, and pine resin, among other things. And it wasn't the light spritz type of perfume we have today. It was thick and lingered for a long time. So it's possible that ancient Egyptian royalty went around smelling like a club somewhere on Miami Beach, which would make sense because Cleopatra apparently really liked to party, if you couldn't already tell by all the pleasure cruises. And when she and Mark Antony got together, things went into overdrive. When Antony came back to Alexandria after Cleo wooed him in Tarsus, they apparently had a grand old time. The couple started a social club called the Society of Inimitable Livers. Inimitable, for those of you without a PhD in unused English words, means so good that it can't be copied. They were basically bragging about how much they could drink. Cleopatra probably said something like,
"My love, I know you're an accomplished general and all, but I do believe I can best you in a competition of pyramid-shaped keg stands."
Not sure what that would mean, but they got their drink on. One legendary story recounts how, in a kind of royal muscle flex, Cleopatra, wanting to prove how wealthy she was, or maybe as a bet between the two, showed off to Antony at a dinner party by drinking a cocktail worth more than $20 million in today's money. After finishing their meal, Cleopatra had a servant bring over a glass filled with a particular type of vinegar and maybe some other extra flavoring. Then she took off one of her massive pearl earrings and dropped it into the glass. The vinegar dissolved the pearl, and then Cleopatra threw it back. Maybe the most expensive cocktail in history. Caesar's Roll.
You can't tell a story about Cleopatra without also talking about Julius Caesar. As we just mentioned, it was Caesar who helped her get back on the throne after she was ousted by her brother/husband, Ptolemy XIII.
Cleopatra was spending her exile in Ashkelon, a city in Judea just south of Jerusalem. But she wasn't just lying around having servants feed her grapes. She was gathering an army and making political connections in Rome. At this point, around 49 BC, Caesar was battling it out with a guy named Pompey for control of Rome. Pompey was losing badly. In a last-ditch effort, he fled to Egypt, where he thought he had an ally in Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy had given him 60 ships and 500 troops earlier that year, and Pompey figured he'd be safe there. But he wasn't. In quite literally a cutthroat move, Ptolemy manipulated the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar. He lured Pompey to Alexandria and then sent a team of assassins to take him out on his own boat. He then presented Pompey's head to Caesar, who had arrived in Alexandria around the same time, thinking Caesar would be thrilled that his rival had been eliminated. But he wasn't. Whether it was genuine disgust or a feigned politically motivated about-face, Caesar was said to have been horrified by the act and began imploring Ptolemy and Cleopatra to end their feud and figure out a way to make peace. Cleopatra, clever as ever, saw an end, a way to get the entire Roman Empire on her side and win back Egypt. At this point, she had made her way back to Egypt from Judea, but she was still on the outside looking in, camped out in the city of Pelusium on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. Now one night, while Ptolemy was sleeping, thinking his sister was miles away and dreaming of an empire, Cleopatra snuck into Caesar's guest quarters at the Palace of Alexandria. According to the historian Plutarch, she hid in a rolled-up rug, which was delivered to Caesar by Cleopatra's assistant. It's uncertain whether this account is legend or fact, but we do know that once she met Caesar, Cleopatra was very, very convincing. A love affair blossomed between the two. An impassioned Caesar became committed to helping his new lover. First, he jailed Ptolemy XIII. Then, he tried some diplomacy, proposing that Cleopatra's other brother, Ptolemy XIV, and her sister Arsinoe rule together in Cyprus. This didn't go down too well. The older Ptolemy XIII broke out of prison and then teamed up with his sister Arsinoe. They amassed their armies and laid siege to Alexandria for several months between 48 and 47 BC.
Now, during the siege, Cleopatra and Caesar remained locked in the royal palace where they apparently had a pretty good time. It was here where many people believe Cleopatra conceived her first and only child with Caesar, Caesarion.
Eventually, Cleopatra and Caesar defeated her rival siblings. Ptolemy XIII was taken, possibly drowned in a river on Cleopatra's orders, and Arsinoe was exiled to Ephesus. Cleopatra then married her other brother Ptolemy XIV, who was still basically a child at this point because, again, Cleopatra was a woman and needed a co-ruler, and Caesar had to be getting back to Rome. A year later, in 46 BC, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. She was publicly flaunting her little Caesar around all over the place, and had even built a temple dedicated to Caesar's son in Alexandria. Caesar, however, remained silent, never publicly claiming Caesarion as his offspring. In Rome, Cleopatra was put up in one of Caesar's villas, where she mingled with Roman officials. Now, during her trip, a temple was even built called the Temple of Venus Genetrix with a gold statue of her. It directly associated Cleopatra with the goddess Venus, who was considered the mother of all of Rome. It wasn't a move that was particularly liked by a lot of Romans, and 2 years later, on the Ides of March, Caesar was famously stabbed in the back by about 44 Roman senators. Cleopatra was still in Rome when Caesar died, and although she must have been pretty heartbroken, she was still an intelligent politician and queen, and she tried her best to get Caesarion named as Caesar's heir, a move that would have possibly united Egypt and Rome and led to a whole different course of historical events. Imagine a Roman-Egyptian empire. Maybe they'd have called it like Rogyptia. It wasn't to be, though. Caesar had named his grandnephew Octavian as his heir, and Cleopatra went back to Alexandria to regroup.
Cleopatra's perfume ships. So if we want to understand Cleopatra, it's worth first taking a look at her ship, or ships really. Way before Tinder or Hinge, pleasure cruises were her go-to method of wooing powerful leaders, particularly Julius Caesar and Mark Antony.
Caesar came first. It was 47 BC. Caesar had just helped Cleopatra take back Alexandria after she was exiled by her brother/husband Ptolemy XIII. And yes, that was actually a common thing in Ptolemaic Egypt. Brother-sister marriages were considered a good way to consolidate power, although there's no evidence that Cleopatra and her brother ever, consummated the marriage. Anyway, after Caesar swooped in and came to Cleopatra's rescue, they took a romantic cruise down the Nile. For real though, saying that Caesar swooped in like a knight in shining armor and came to Cleopatra's rescue isn't entirely accurate, but later for that. Let's stick to ships. According to some accounts, the ship they eloped in was the Thalamigos. It was a massive twin-hulled barge, basically a floating city. There are all kinds of stories about the grandeur of her ship. It was apparently 300 feet long. It was lined with ebony, or gold depending on the source. It had a garden on deck. It was, all in all, a huge ship befitting the Pharaoh of Egypt.
A leviathan of a vessel, propelled by several banks of oarsmen, it was fitted out with, in addition to bedrooms and salons, colonnaded courts, banquet halls, a winter garden, shrines of Aphrodite and Dionysus, and decorated with lavish employment of cedar and cypress woods, varied paints, and gold leaf.
Yet whether or not the ship was actually the Thalamigos is a matter of fairly intense debate among historians, because the Thalamigos was built by Ptolemy IV back in 200 BC, a little more than 150 years before Cleopatra and Caesar were said to have made their romantic cruise down the Nile. Now, it's possible that the ship was very durable and able to maintain its seaworthiness for that long, but it's also possible that it was a newer ship of the same type. Another source claims that the Ptolemies had a liking for big structures. The barge in this instance was 300 feet long, 45 feet across the beam, and 60 feet high. They journeyed along the Nile so that Caesar had an opportunity to inspect the land and its Hellenistic pattern of administration. Here, it seems like Cleopatra and Caesar's pleasure cruise also doubled as a diplomatic mission, one where Caesar could get a lay of the land, pun intended.
I stand before you today to recount an extraordinary voyage, a journey that has taken me across the vast expanse of the Nile, alongside the captivating Queen Cleopatra. Together, we have sailed upon a magnificent ancient Egyptian ship, adorned with splendor and grandeur that rival even the gods themselves. As we embarked on this unparalleled adventure, my eyes were greeted by a sight that few have witnessed: the awe-inspiring architecture and rich culture of ancient Egypt. From the moment our vessel set sail, I found myself captivated by the majesty that surrounded me. The pyramids, reaching towards the heavens, stood as testament to the greatness of a civilization that has flourished for millennia. Yet, beneath the surface of my admiration, a hidden intention lingered, driven by the ambitions that fuel the heart of a conqueror. For even as I marveled at the splendor of Egypt's past, my gaze subtly shifted, seeking not only the beauty of the present, but also the possibilities of the future. The ancient structures whispered secrets of power and wealth, beckoning me to envision a Rome united with the riches of this remarkable land.
This was a running theme with Cleopatra. She loved to seduce, but also she used her seduction diplomatically as a tool to help her with foreign policy. The next time Cleopatra used a boat to win someone over came 6 years later. This time it was Mark Antony. At this point, Caesar had been literally stabbed in the back, and Antony had risen up the ranks of the Roman military, first to become part of what's called the Second Triumvirate, a secret three-way alliance between Antony, a guy named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and Octavian, the man who would eventually become Augustus Caesar, Rome's first emperor. The triumvirate would eventually be whittled down to a duumvirate after the death of Lepidus, and Rome was basically split in half. The west under the control of Octavian, and the east ruled by Antony. By the summer of 41 BC, Antony had established a base in Tarsus on the coast of what's now modern-day Turkey. Antony was planning a campaign in the east against the Parthian Empire, but he needed money. Well, Cleopatra had a lot of that. At this point, she may have been the wealthiest woman in the world. Antony wrote her letter after letter, asking her to come meet him in Tarsus. Cleopatra played hard to get, though. She wanted something from him, which was, well, him. She eventually sailed to Tarsus, and she did it with her trademark flair. The Greek historian Plutarch, who wrote a history of Antony in the 1st century AD, described their meeting like this.
She came sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with gilded stern and outspread sails of purple, while oars of silver beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. She herself lay all along under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a picture, and beautiful young boys, like painted cupids, stood on each side to fan her. Perfumes diffused themselves from the vessel to the shore, and word went through the multitudes that Venus was come to feast with Bacchus for the common good of Asia.
Antony was mesmerized. They feasted, had deep conversations, they fooled around, and eventually Antony was, quote, carried away by her to Alexandria, there to keep holiday, like a boy in playing diversion, squandering and fooling away in enjoyment that most costly of all valuables, time. It would be a fateful love affair, one that would politically benefit both Antony and Cleopatra until it didn't. Their fling drew the ire of Octavian and Roman higher-ups who thought Antony was selling out Roman values and getting too cozy with Egypt, but more on that later. Family drama and civil war.
First, let's rewind a bit. Cleopatra was born at a pretty crazy time for the Egyptian Empire. The Ptolemaic kingdom was holding on by a thread and had been for pretty much all 300 years of its history. The Ptolemies, Cleopatra included, were not actually Egyptian.
They were Macedonian Greek. They took control of Egypt after Alexander the Great swooped in and conquered it back in 332 BC. Now, over the years, Rome quickly became the world's leading power, and by 60 BC, Cleopatra's father and pharaoh of Egypt, Ptolemy XII, was in the hot seat. Cleopatra's family came from a long line of, let's say, brother and sisterly love. Her parents were brother and sister, and Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers over the course of her time on the Egyptian throne. Historians aren't really sure how intimate things got between Cleo and her brothers, but given that she never had any kids with them, can we assume the marriages were never consummated? But then again, the Egyptians did have some decent ways to prevent little humans from being born, if you know what I mean. In 58 BC, Rome annexed Cyprus, which had been ruled by Ptolemy's brother, Ptolemy of Cyprus. The Romans accused him of aiding pirates who were messing with their shipping routes. Rather than face exile, Ptolemy of Cyprus took his own life, a decision that was pretty popular for a lot of the defeated rulers around this time. Throughout all of this, Ptolemy XII remained relatively silent, but with the Egyptian economy in shambles, This show of weakness was the straw that broke the Egyptian camel's back. Ptolemy was forced out of Egypt, exiled to the outskirts of Rome with his daughter, an 11-year-old Cleopatra. Ptolemy and the young Cleopatra landed in the villa of Pompey the Great, a powerful Roman general who was then part of the First Triumvirate, the predecessor of the Second Triumvirate. This first iteration was a secret three-way alliance between Pompey, Julius Caesar, and a guy named Marcus Licinius Crassus, who were conspiring to overthrow the Roman Republic and set up their own government. Basically, they each wanted to be emperor, but a bunch of complex checks and balances within the Republic wouldn't allow that, so they created this shadowy pact, promising to help each other consolidate power. Now, like most secret pacts between power-hungry men, it would soon fall apart and lead to a Roman civil war. At Pompey's villa, a young Cleopatra met Julius Caesar. Sparks were eventually lit that would ignite a future romance that would eventually change the course of history. But it would be a brief visit. Ptolemy reclaimed his throne with the aid of Pompey and his ally, Aulus Gabinius, who at the time served as the Roman governor of Syria. In 55 BC, Gabinius invaded Egypt and deposed Berenice IV, who had been sitting on the throne since Ptolemy's exile. Berenice was Ptolemy's daughter, and there was a lot of animosity between the two. Berenice wanted Ptolemy to remain in exile, but Ptolemy's Roman connections were too powerful. Shortly after Ptolemy retook the throne, he had Berenice and her allies executed. Power took precedence over family, apparently. Cleopatra's father was all too willing to execute his own daughter to get back the Egyptian pharaohship, but Cleopatra was equally willing to off her own family members to maintain or take back power. She had a hand in the deaths of 3 of her siblings. The first was her younger brother/husband, Ptolemy XIII. Now, you heard that correctly. Cleopatra actually had 2 sibling husbands and played a direct role in how both of them were taken out. She was a woman, after all, and wasn't really allowed to rule alone.
In 52 BC, Ptolemy XII died and left the keys to the Egyptian empire in Cleopatra's hands. She was able to shrewdly fix the financial mess that her father had left her with and use her budding connections in Rome to make it happen. By 48 BC, Ptolemy XIII didn't like how much attention Cleopatra was getting. Ptolemy, being the male heir, should have been the sole ruler. However, his older sister was clearly the better ruler. Her face was starting to get minted on coins. She was the one making all the important decisions. Her signature was on all the important royal documents. He was being left behind and excluded, kind of like turning into Fredo Corleone.
So he had Cleopatra ousted and exiled. She went on the run for a second time, first to nearby Thebes and later to Judea. A full-on civil war erupted. Arsinoe IV, a sister of Cleopatra and Ptolemy, then threw her hat into the ring for the title of Pharaoh of Egypt, further complicating matters. The sibling rivalry was taken to new heights, but Cleopatra refused to accept defeat. She came back later with the help of her lover and Roman superman, Julius Caesar, who said,
"Don't worry, Cleo, my love. You may be married to your brother, but I'll make sure that doesn't last much longer."
Julius defeated her brother and then drowned him in the Nile, allegedly. Then came that Nile pleasure cruise with Caesar that we talked about earlier. Next up was her sibling husband, Ptolemy XIV, whom she had poisoned so she could have her son Caesarion, or Little Caesar, join her as co-regent. Then a few years later, she had her younger sister, Arsinoe, taken out after she'd been exiled to Cyprus because they thought she'd be a threat to her authority. Like father, like daughter, it seems.
Cleopatra's triumph. Let's get into the relationship between Cleopatra and Antony. We've already seen how Cleopatra and her purple-sailed ship swooped into Tarsus back in 41 BC and won over the Roman leader. Afterwards, they eloped back to Alexandria for a year, where they apparently had a grand old time. They partied hardier than frat boys, it seems. We've already mentioned their drinking club, the Society of Inimitable Livers, and Cleopatra's drink that was so expensive it would make tech moguls think twice about their spending habits.
But in 40 BC, Antony returned to Rome, leaving a now pregnant Cleopatra in Alexandria. She would soon give birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Meanwhile, in a political move, Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia. It would be another 3 years before Antony and Cleopatra reunited, but reunite they did, in Antioch, the capital of Syria, in 37 BC. They got right back at it, and Cleopatra had another child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, a year later. The power couple even began minting currency with both their faces on it. For the next 2 years, Cleopatra would join Antony on various military missions throughout the Mediterranean. But around this time, Antony began losing focus on the military side of things. The historian Plutarch pinned the blame on Cleopatra.
So eager was he to spend the winter with her, that he began the war before the proper time and managed everything confusedly. He was not master of his own faculties, but, as if he were under the influence of certain drugs or of magic rites, was ever looking eagerly towards her, and thinking more of his speedy return than of conquering the enemy.
But Antony's military fortunes would change in 34 BC when, with the help of Cleopatra's purse, he conquered Armenia. A year earlier, the Armenians had backed out of their alliance with Antony as he was invading the Parthian Empire and he wanted revenge. He got it and brought the Armenian royals back to Alexandria, where they were paraded through the streets in chains in a public shaming/celebration called a tribute. Yeah, like that. It was a huge spectacle that became known as the Donations of Alexandria. Antony, Cleopatra, and their children, plus Caesar's kid, addressed a huge crowd, dressed up like gods, and Antony doled out yet more land and titles to Cleopatra and their kids.
In the open court of the complex that fall day, the Alexandrians discovered another silver platform, on which stood two massive golden thrones. Mark Antony occupied one. Addressing her as the new Isis, he invited Cleopatra to join him on the other. She appeared in the full regalia of that goddess, a pleated, lustrously striped chiton, its fringed edge reaching to her ankles. On her head she may have worn a traditional tripartite crown or one of cobras with a culture cap. By one account, Antony was dressed as Dionysus, in a gold-embroidered gown and high Greek boots. Cleopatra's children occupied four smaller thrones at the couple's feet. In his husky voice, Antony addressed the assembled multitude.
Antony apparently staged the whole thing in order to provoke Octavian, and it worked. Octavian was furious that he was giving out all these lands to a bunch of illegitimate Egyptian kids, while his sister and Antony's actual wife, Octavia, waited around in Rome. War was brewing. Rome's propaganda machine.
The donations of Alexandria fueled fire to an already smoldering distaste for Antony among Octavian and other Roman officials. They hated that Cleopatra and Egypt were growing so powerful and getting to control so much land that they thought should really be Rome's. As a result, a propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra developed that would make today's fake news claims look like Drake's Child's Play. Now, I don't know what that means. I'm just telling you what it says here for me to tell you. Apparently, they want to make reference to some hip-hop song. I know nothing about hip-hop. I'm just doing the nutty history videos over here.
A year after the donation scene, a full-on propaganda war had erupted between Antony and Octavian. Cleopatra stuck dead in the middle of it. Antony was trying to spread these lies from Alexandria, but Octavian was in Rome and had the upper hand in the lie spreading. He basically started a campaign that claimed Antony had been bewitched by Cleopatra, very literally bewitched. He cast Cleopatra as a kind of foreign sorceress who was using Antony like a puppet and threatening the very fabric of Roman society. The final nail in Antony's public relations coffin came when Octavian got his hands on his will. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not the will was real or fake, but given the fabrications back and forth, it seems like it could very well have been fake. In the will, Antony had apparently left large pieces of Roman-controlled land to his Egyptian children, something the Romans really didn't like. It also apparently stated that Caesarion, Cleopatra's first son with Julius Caesar, was the rightful heir to the throne, which put Octavian's rule in jeopardy as the adopted son of Caesar. Now, the final insult, and maybe the biggest middle finger to Rome, was the fact that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria when he died, and not Rome. Octavian went on an Antony smearing campaign. He read the will out loud to the Senate and sent copies of it throughout the empire that were posted in public squares for everyone to see. And it worked. The Senate declared Antony a traitor, stripped him of his military rank, and then declared war on Egypt.
When Octavian decided to invade Egypt, it wasn't much of a fight. Antony and Cleopatra's combined naval forces met Octavian's at Actium, off the coast of Greece in 31 BC. Despite having a smaller army, Octavian's men were better trained, and it was a rout. Cleopatra and Antony fled the battle on Cleopatra's purple-sailed ship Antonia, and left leaderless, their forces soon surrendered to Octavian.
Antony and Cleopatra regrouped and put up one last stand at the end of July 30 BC, but it was no use. Octavian marched victoriously into Alexandria, taken aback by the beauty and sophistication of the city. A romance forged in blood.
You know, by this point, Cleopatra was holed up in her own tomb in Alexandria, surrounded by piles and piles of royal treasure. You know how I know it was piles and piles? Because I'm doing my hands like this. The forces of Octavian, though, had her surrounded.
They had just taken the city. This was it, the last gasps of an Egyptian empire that had stood for thousands of years. In Cleopatra's lap lay her dying lover, bleeding, mortally wounded from a self-inflicted stab wound. He had run himself through with his own sword after getting a letter from Cleopatra that suggested that she was no longer alive. She was still alive, though, but it was too late. When news reached Antony that she was still alive, a group of his closest advisors took him, bloodied and dying, to her tomb. There, he slipped away in Cleopatra's arms.
Octavian showed her some pity. She was allowed to give Antony a proper burial, but in the days that followed, Cleopatra slipped away. As a prisoner in her own tomb, she fell into despair, but she was still defiant. When she met Octavian one last time, she spoke directly and bluntly. One of the only direct quotes attributed to Cleopatra, recorded by the Roman historian Livy, was, "I will not be led in a triumph." Octavian really wanted to bring Cleopatra back to Rome and parade her around in her defeat, a humiliating march like the one Antony and Cleopatra had held for the Armenian royals after defeating Armenia a few years earlier. Cleopatra wouldn't have any of that, though. She'd go out on her own terms.
Now, how Cleopatra took her own life is up for debate. Some say she snuck an asp into her tomb and had it bite her directly. Others say she snuck a vial of poison in and went that way. Whichever way it happened, she was gone. Gone with her were the hopes she had for a vast empire, one built through her children and their connections to Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Shortly after her death, Octavian had Caesarion taken out. After all, he was Caesar's potential heir and a threat to his own absolute rule. The rest of Cleopatra's children were taken to Rome and paraded in the same triumph that Cleopatra refused to accept. So Egypt fell to Rome, and the civilization that lasted thousands of years crumbled for good. Cleopatra's life was one of the most interesting in all of history, full of intrigue, romance, and just about everything else. No wonder it's been told and retold for centuries. What else do you know about Cleopatra? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history.